I guess we're going through, Mary. I'm just wanted to give it a second to see if it was coming through on YouTube. So welcome everybody. I'm glad you could make it today. This is a special one for me. I usually do one live stream a month, and this is the first time I've had the opportunity to talk to have a guest on my live stream. So I'm really excited. I've known Mary for a few years. I think I met her 2015 maybe, when I had the kiln conference in Safford. I was looking for archaeologists to invite to give a talk about prehistoric ceramics, and it's sometimes hard to get archaeologists to come because they have other things to do and they're busy. And I was specifically looking for somebody. It was funny. I was looking for somebody in Tucson, and because Mary worked for Desert Archaeology, I assumed she was in Tucson. I don't think I learned until sometime later that she was actually living up in Grants, New Mexico. So I was like, "What? You're not in Tucson?" So she has the ability to kind of work from home, which is cool for what she does. And so let me let her talk a little bit about who she is and what she does. And then I've got all these questions lined up. And first of all, I want to let you know that I asked these questions about a week ago using the community tab here on YouTube and then also on Facebook. And so I was able to compile a list of questions ahead of time. Now, if we get through all these questions, we can have some questions that you all ask, but we may not, is what I'm saying, because we already have a list of questions to go through with Mary. But we have an hour, so we'll see what we can do. And so let's let Mary talk about who she is and what she does for a minute first.
Hi. So, I still work at Desert Archaeology about part-time, but I also started my own business offering analytical services for archaeologists. Especially, I was getting a lot of great projects to collaborate on with people in academia, independent researchers, and just other groups, grad students. Always fun to work with them. And so I started my own business to help facilitate that, to get them access to analysis of mostly ceramics, but other materials, and using more scientific methods. So I focus a lot on using a microscope to look at pottery. It's called ceramic petrography, and it took from the field of geology. You will find archaeologists steal most of our greatest methods and tools for looking at artifacts from other fields. So we have a method we took from the geological sciences to help us understand where pottery is made and what it's made of. So I focus a lot on that, but I also do other methods involving chemical analysis and looking at elemental data. I can use a scanning electron microscope, thanks to my mom in part, and I've done a couple of other methods as well. So that's kind of my area of specialty. I have too many degrees from many places that helped enable me to work collaboratively with groups throughout the United States, but I also specialize in work in Egypt and the Near East as well. So that's been my main focus. Let me close the door to my room real quickly while Andy cues up the first question.
Yeah, so real quick, let me just go over a couple of things that I wanted to talk to you guys about. First of all, John Olson, who's a well-known replicator here in the Southwest, is suffering from cancer. And there is a GoFundMe to help him with his medical expenses. And the link to that is down in the description. So if you want to help out with John Olson and his fight with cancer. The Southwest Kiln Conference is coming up the first week in October, and that's in Silver City, New Mexico. That's a great place to go if you want to learn about pottery and how ancient pottery was made. And then my Ancient Potters Club, we actually make pottery together over Zoom every Wednesday evening. So if you're interested in learning more about it and getting together with some like-minded individuals, that Ancient Potters Club is a good way to do that. And the link to that is also down in the description. And also don't forget to hit the like button. So that'll help the algorithm and help us push this video out to more people. So the first question for Mary is just basically, Mary, what kind of information can we learn about ancient sherds from examining them under a microscope?
Well, it's actually a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun to be able to look at a sherd at that high magnification. So while the actual clay particles themselves are still too small for me to see, I can get a general sense of a clay type. Does it look like a shale? I've seen lots of shale clay potteries. Is it more sort of variable, and maybe it's coming from along a river, like a secondary deposit. Then I look at what has been added by the potter, if anything has been added. And that's very helpful to a lot of the ceramicists that I collaborate with. What did they do to alter that clay? Did they add stuff, and what did they add? One of my principal focuses is on identifying the mineral inclusions and rock fragments within the pottery, because that can give us a sense of the type of geology that was, utilized for sand timber, for example. So if I see a lot of a volcanic rock like basalt in there, which sometimes happens, not always. Basalt's not very friendly for hand building because it's sharp, as you can believe. But then I can say, okay, well, this potter had to have access to an area with basalt sand if he was adding it to his maybe secondary clay. So that tells me what the potter's choices were. So then I could look, and if I know where the pottery came from, the particular site, I can look at geological maps. And that's a lot of stuff is actually in Google Earth now. It's very helpful. And I can assess if that potter was near a place that might have some basalt outcrops. Then I can look in the geological literature and see if that matches what I'm seeing, if that's potential. And we can use that information to then, decide like, yes, that means that this piece of pottery was probably made where it was found, or no. Maybe it's got a lot of limestone in it and the potter is nowhere near any limestone outcrops. So we can say, nope, this is probably not made there. We may then be able to say, if we think there's another site it could be coming from. And that kind of tees up, looking at raw materials collection to compare. Sort of the final thing I can do is I can generally assess firing temperatures. I can sort of see how much the clay has kind of melted thanks to the firing. Most pottery is usually fired between about 750 and about 850 Celsius. So that's the range at which clays really will solidify into a hard piece of pottery. And especially in the Southwest, people are going to expend extra wood resources to go higher than that if they don't need to. I've looked at a few higher temperature items, some glazed-ware from Egypt, for example, where they have to get higher temperatures for the clays. So generally I get an understanding of what did the potter do and where was he maybe, and how did he approach making his sherd? And if we understand that, can we understand his role and the pottery's role in the society that he was a part of? And then that leads to other questions we can answer about connections and movements of people and even economies. My PhD was on material that was really looking at economy and movement of transport vessels and how that related to different fairly stratified societies.
Now, you talked about, just a follow-up question real quick. You talked about pottery being fired hotter than usual here in Egypt. Now, I would think Egypt would be at least as short on wood as we are, maybe more so. Is that not true?
No, it is. Actually, it is very much true. The glazeware I was talking about is medieval glazeware. And so at that time, they actually, I think, may have been even using something more like coal or charcoal or something to get to higher temperatures. So, but even when you look at later stuff in Egypt, I've looked at some modern stuff recently. Firing temperatures are usually around the 800 Celsius range, maybe a little higher or lower on either end of that. So that's usually, again, when the clay will solidify. So that's usually when they
I can get behind that number.
Oh, that's what's great about the work you do. You can do that angle to kind of confirm. I mean, people have done lots of studies with firing pottery with temperature gauges and seeing how hot you can get things. So it's always nice to kind of know what I'm seeing in the microscope is what
Definitely.
other people are seeing.
Yeah, it's really helpful for potters who are trying to make replicas to be able to talk to people like you and know if you can say around what temperature it was fired at. That's very, very helpful.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to achieve a particular type of paint, let's say like White Mountain Redware, like glaze paint or organic paint on Salado polychromes, and you're just trying to do it blind, you have to do a lot of experiments. If you can talk to somebody like you and say, the range that was fired at is right in here. That is so helpful and saves you a lot of experimenting.
Yeah. And I so much from what you guys do, because then I get a better sense for what the materials can handle, what works well, what approaches really help me to understand, because I have my microscopic view, as I like to say, but then I really have to take all of that information and put it into a context of what are the possibilities for making pottery and how would somebody approach that in their particular cultural setting. Are they, for instance, I have to consider a lot about, are we talking about a sedentary society, or are we talking about a mobile society? That is greatly going to impact the clay they choose, when they make pottery, where they make it. I've had many case studies, particularly in the US, in which I can clearly identify that pottery is being made at a particular time and place when other activities are taking place in that location, and it isn't where you find the pottery. So.
Cool. Okay, ready for the next question? And you know what I didn't do, guys? I'll apologize right now. Is when I wrote down all the questions that had been asked, like I said, on the community tab and on Facebook, I didn't write down who asked the question. So some of you may recognize these as your questions, and I apologize. I should also have had on here, this was asked by so-and-so, but I didn't. So this question is, how do you start your research, and does it involve actual field work?
Yeah, well, again, these are all fantastic questions. So for the anonymous people out there, thank you. These are great. My research starts in several ways, mostly collaboratively. Again, my business is ownbyanalytical.com, so somebody can email me. And usually it starts with, I have a bag of sherds and some questions. And then I can say, great, tell me more. So I usually work with ceramicists, and I get as much information from them as I can on where the pottery is coming from, what kind of society made the pottery, what's the history and culture, and then what are those research questions that they really want to know. Then I usually start looking at a geological map, because I need to tell people, what is the potential for, let's say, ceramic petrography, even chemistry, to help us answer their questions. So if some place has a lot of geological variability, that's great. That's perfect. That works well for both techniques. We might really get down to where a specific place's pottery was made. However, if it's, like northern Arizona and northern New Mexico, there can be the same limestone and sandstone outcrops for large distances, and it may be harder to answer such questions. When I work in Egypt, there's the Nile. Guess what? They made a lot of pottery with Nile clay, and it's very similar. There's probably subtle differences because it's a long Nile river, but that's one where I do have to tell my colleagues, here's what I can do, here's what I can't do, here's what we can look at. And there we really look at choices that potters made. Is this a cooking vessel? Did they decide to use a particular recipe of clay and timber for the cooking vessel? Do cooking vessels use that same recipe at many sites? Is that something they shared and shows that they felt they had a common relationship and identity? So we really focus our research questions on the pottery itself, where it's coming from, the geology. I love doing field work. It's great. Sometimes I get stuck in the lab, become pale and withered, and it is awesome when I can go do field work. And I always try, if possible, to integrate collecting sand, especially in southern Arizona. We have a huge program of sand collecting because they use that as timber, and that can give us very specific locations of making of the pottery. I do some clay collecting. That is more challenging. Clay is actually quite readily available, so it can be difficult to identify specific resources in an area that were used. So that usually is where my field work is. I always recommend we do a small study of pottery first. This happened with a recent project from Uzbekistan. I said, send me some sherds. Sorry, the cat wants to participate. Send me some sherds, and let's get an idea of what they were doing. What kind of raw materials might they have been using? And then we can think about where we want to sample some raw materials. So that's what happened. I looked at the pottery. I said, here's what I'm seeing. We looked at the landscape. It's actually very dry there, but there's some old river channels. So we targeted the tell where the site was and some of those river channels. She sent me way too many big bags of clay from Uzbekistan, but I was able to make some test files. One of the clays was lovely, absolutely perfect, would make pottery with that any day. Some of the others were not as nice to work with. And then we made thin sections of those so I could look at them under the microscope, and I can see a lot of similarities, but some differences. So I've been able to sort of suggest that some of the pottery may have been made at the site with these raw materials, but some might not have been. And so she's pretty happy, and I'm pretty happy, and we were glad we could get very large bags of clay from Uzbekistan.
Awesome. That's cool. You ready for the next question?
Yeah.
All righty. What are the different methods of analyzing sherds?
Well, we've developed a lot, like I mentioned, we've taken a lot from other scientists. So I focus on using the microscope. It's a geological microscope called a polarizing microscope that allows me to look at the rock fragments and mineral grains, and the clay, again, not as individual particles. Like I said, I've worked with scanning electron microscopy. That's been really helpful if you want to look at particular inclusions or you want to understand firing temperatures. It's just so much higher magnification. And they also have a way of getting chemistry on things. So I recently completed a study doing microprobe analyses. And we were focusing on the clay because the pottery has a lot of grog. And we wanted to see if sherds with grog and sherds without grog might be made with clay that was similar. So that's similar to a scanning electron microscope, which you can also use for analyzing paints on the surface. I did a project on that for Pottery found in Tucson. And then really there's a lot of methods for getting chemical data. The biggest one that's often used is neutron activation analysis. So you're irradiating your little powdered sherd and it becomes radioactive. And then as it decays, you can determine what elements are there and how much. But other methods are X-ray fluorescence analysis. One is called laser ablation inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry, which is also good for looking at paints.
Is that the one where they had the little gun that they brought to the conference a few years ago?
No, that was actually portable X-ray
Okay.
spectrometry, which I don't do as much of because pottery is quite, especially here in the United States, pottery is quite chunky and there's lots of big grains in it.
Mm-hmm.
And you have a tiny area that you're analyzing with that. So in the field, people have worked variably with this instrument. In some cases, it does seem to work well, and in others, not as well. In Egypt, some people were working on it, but it turned out that the groups you could make with the data from one of these portable instruments was no different than what the ceramicist was able to do with her eye. Ceramicists know their pottery so well on site. They're amazing. So classify it really quite effectively, and then they can send samples from each of their groups for me to look at to discuss what I see as well. So so those are the kind of major instruments that we use. There's a few other ones. You can do residue analysis if you want to know what a pottery vessel contained. This is great if you have cooking pots and you want to know how they were used, or you have a set of vessels and you can't figure out based on where they're found what they did for the past society. Some of them have found milk. They were used for making cheese, wine, always a favorite, beer, stews. So it's really great to do residue analysis and understand how a pot was being used. There's one that looks at sort of the molecular structure for near transform infrared spectrometry. Some of those can be used to look at firing temperatures or the clay type. Then you can get some better understanding of where the pot was made based on clay type. So we've scoured the chemistry folks looking for methods that and physics that help us. And we're very lucky to have these instruments. And it's great when we can use them for projects to address specific questions.
To me, it's astounding the amount of information that you can pull out of these broken sherds, especially since they've been laying around for centuries. That information is still there. Always fun to learn about what's being done or read report. I mean, to a lot of people, these reports are probably pretty dry, but to me, they're like ice cream.
I try to make them like, I usually tell people just read the conclusions, but I think what's to me is we're using all this advanced scientific instrumentation to get things about the clays and the timber and things, and these are things the potter never thought about ever.
Right.
What works. This is what people like. He knows where to get his clay. He knows how to make some paste. Sorry, cat again. That really works to the purpose that he has. So that's the important thing is, take what you're getting from these advanced instruments and make sure it's meaningful by relating it to what would the potter have been doing and the society he was in, and how did that actually, help us understand the past. So I always try to go from my microscopic view all the way to a better understanding of what was happening in the past. So
that's great. All right. The next question is, how do you determine and this probably ties into what you were just talking about, how do you determine the chemical composition of clay and porcelain, and what technology do you use to do this?
Again, mostly it's the neutron activation analysis is very common. Other methods were the plasma spectrometry methods, X-ray fluorescence spectrometry methods. So usually people like the neutron activation analysis method because the sensitivity of the instrument is parts per billion. So, and you can get about 30 plus elemental data on that. So that's a good one to go with. What I'd like to say about those is that, yes, there are very many choices in terms of how to get the chemical data. It'll depend on cost, access, how much material is destroyed, usually not too much. But you have to use statistical analysis. So what you do is you run your samples through these instruments. They spit out a lovely Excel file full of data for each sherd, what the amount of calcium, silica, dysprosium is. But to really then understand what sherds are similar to each other, so you can try to understand how the pottery is made in the past, you have to apply different statistical tests. And I have a background in doing that, which is helpful. I can look at the elemental data with the statistical tests I like to use. I can see what samples of pottery are similar and what are different. And then I can select some samples for petrography from those groups. And then I can look at that and say, oh, yes, this group over here, group A, is similar because it's all got, maybe some schist in it, metamorphic rock. This group over here is not like that, and I'm looking at it in the thin section, and it's because maybe it has a lot more schist in it, or maybe it has granite in it, a plutonic rock, or maybe it has a very small amount of schist. So the petrography plus the statistics can take those elemental data and help us understand better, what is causing the patterns in the elemental data and what that means for understanding how the pottery is made and where. A lot of people love to say, oh, well, you go, you collect some clay and you get chemistry on the clay, and then you get chemistry on your pottery, and voila, it was made with that clay. That is incredibly challenging to do because potters, as I'm sure Andy can tell you, will manipulate their clays. They can make it so they're only taking a small, tiny fractions of the clay, and all the other stuff is coarse material is floated out in water. Or again, they can add things. So it's actually quite challenging to take clay you collect near a site and the pottery you analyze from that site and get them to match chemically because of what the potter has done. But I find that to be interesting. That's where the potter made his choices, and he worked with his material as he knew he could. So.
Yeah, I remember talking to an archaeologist a few years ago who was talking about how she felt like they were mixing different clays. And I would think that would really throw you guys off if you're trying to source a clay. And I do the same thing. It's easy if you have one clay that has some properties you want, another that has another, and then you mix them together and get the perfect clay body. And then you go to try to do, source it, and nothing fits because it's mixed. And does the temper also throw that off, or is it easy to kind of separate that?
No, the temper will as well. So most of the techniques I mentioned are what we call bulk chemistry techniques. So you take your sugar, grind it into a tiny powder, and everything's in there. The clay, the temper, whatever they did is in that powder, and that's what gets analyzed. That's why I mentioned the grog tempered pottery, where we tried to do some microprobe work to just get chemistry on the clay, because grog is terrible for chemistry. You're pot with pot added in it. Yep. It's very problematic. And clay mixing in Egypt, they have a very calcareous, stiff clay they use. And a lot of times they probably added Nile clay to it to make it more workable. And the challenge there is that there's also likely natural deposits of mixed clay. So I can say, okay, this is clearly a sherd that has been made with a mix of marl calcareous clay and Nile clay, but I never discount the possibility that some kind of deposit existed like that originally, and the potter knew about it, used it, it was great. I take a sort of, I guess, lazy approach when I'm trying to understand what potters do. I'm lazy, so I'm like, hey, if there was a natural deposit that was already there and was a good workable clay, don't, use that, don't mess with it. But so that's tough. It's hard to know when the potter might have done that on purpose or he used a natural deposit. So.
Sure. And honestly, this next question ties right into what we were just talking about. Why is it so darn hard to determine which clays were used by local prehistoric potters?
That's why
I kind of almost answered that.
Yeah, but I would say sometimes temper is easier. So a lot of people focus very much on clays, understandable, but clays are very broadly distributed, and it is hard to know what kind of variability chemically there is within a clay. Clays will go horizontally and then they can be vertically, so it's hard to kind of get a sense of that. If they've added sand temper and you're in an area like Southern Arizona, hooray! You can really look at those rock and mineral inclusions in that sand, and it's often very specific. I've really had cases where I could tie it to a specific site, where I could say this sand temper comes from this site. We know what the sand in the area looks like. This one is from here. Or a study we did on Salado polychrome, which is near and dear to Andy's heart, even samples from sites he'd been to. That area's got great geological variability. We took samples of utility ware, which are more likely to have been made locally. We took samples of sand. So I could take a site and I could say, here's the sand sample, here's the utility ware. Many cases, identical. Sand, that is it. That's the sand they used for that utility ware. Then we could look at that Salado decorated pottery, and we could see some cases, yep, same stuff. And in some cases, no, this pot clearly was made somewhere else. So sometimes the sand, and I have a friend who works on microfossils, and those are actually helpful. If you've got limestone outcrops, they can actually help you identify where the pottery comes from. And the gold standard is kiln oysters. If you can excavate at your site a kiln, it doesn't happen a lot, especially in the Southwest, because they were probably pit kilns or surface kilns, as Andy does. And I also find that potters, they didn't make mistakes that often, much to archaeologists' frustration. So sometimes, there's not a lot of kiln wasters, not as you would expect. That happens more when you're at an industrial level of production. But if you're at a meeting your daily needs level and your local potter is able to do that, seasonally, it's going to be very hard to find that material. So we face challenges. We have some ways of getting around that. And then we try to focus on questions that are also about technology. How was the pot made, and why, and what it was used for, and how did people move around and take their pottery technologies with them?
And, the study she was referencing where she was sourcing Salado polychromes was one of my favorites. It's one of those documents that I keep handy and I refer back to because it has a lot to do with what I do, the work I do. And some of those pots were coming from such distances. I remember when you first mentioned it to me, and I was incredulous. I was like, she must have got something wrong on this, right? Because like
happens.
When you were saying like all the stuff from Kuykendall was coming from the Upper Gila, I was like, no way, right? But I read the report. You obviously do good work, but if anybody's interested in that report, it's online, and if you say, just leave a comment if you're interested in seeing it, I can hook you up with the address to that in the description after the live stream's over. If you're interested in reading, it's a little technical, but if you do want to read some of that technical type stuff that Mary writes, it is interesting, at least to me.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think I sent you the actual petrographic report. There is a recent publication that's come out.
Yeah, I have the one that came from it's in like it was published in a magazine or something, and it's on one of those websites where archaeologists post reports. Academia.com or something.
Yeah, that's a better one. We did recently.
I'm thinking of, because I can just post a link to it and people can go read it.
Yeah, that'd be better, because we did recently publish that work as part of an article in which I was discussing a more methodological problem in the archaeological and anthropological sciences. So that's come out, but that's kind of a bit more focused on issues when you do try to combine chemistry with petrography and what happens in those cases. So cool. The petrographic report I think I sent to you and is available online has a little more detail about how I determined where things were made and things and were moving. So.
Okay, the next question is, it's a little bit long. Are there samples of pottery that have tested to have basalt as a tempering agent? Would basalt add fluxing to the clay or harm the integrity/strength?
Yeah, so, we don't find basalt, even for people who live near basalt areas, used as a temper very much, either as a crushed item, which I don't think they do that much crushing rock. That's kind of tough. or as a sand. Sometimes basalt will be a component in a more mixed lithic sand that they use. Basalt, where I live, is quite common. It's never used. They use shale clays and grog as their preferred paste. It probably wouldn't add a fluxing to the clay to help lower the firing temperature. And when you're hand building, it might be too sharp. So I think for myself, I wouldn't want to build with that. Maybe Andy might know better. If you were
what I know is that I think Zia Pueblo uses crushed basalt as their tempering. I've never heard that it has a flux to it. Now, would volcanic cinders be considered basalt?
No, usually we term that tough, and it's not as angular. I mean, it's a little glassy, can be a little glassy, but usually what they use is weathered tough, so it's not as glassy.
When basalt, it's more like the solid rocks, not the cinder.
Yeah.
When I was up at John Olson's house last summer, he was using volcanic cinders for tempering.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, most reasons people add temper is to maybe the clay is very sticky and temper can help make it more workable. It's great for drying because little tiny voids will form around rock and mineral fragments because the clay can't really stick to it, and so those little voids are great for helping a vessel dry, and it helps it when firing. It gives that a little bit of extra room during the firing. And then also if you're using the vessel for cooking, those little extra room around those individual grains can be great for a vessel kind of expanding and shrinking during cooking. We call it thermal shock. So those are great properties and why people, I think, have used those kinds of materials. So if you did use basalt and you added it and it worked well, and again, you're not wheel throwing because I don't think it will work very well. Most pottery in the new world is hand built. And the pottery in the old world is largely wheel thrown, and wheel thrown pottery tends not to have much sand temper because you want a more fluid clay paste that can move with the centrifugal.
They're the ones that'll complain about the sharp edges of the
yes.
temper.
I would not.
Shreds. Yeah.
Exactly. I would not want to throw anything with basalt in it. So I think there's always it's a great question because there's always this kind of trying to, I can say, okay, they use the sand temper, but maybe they had a lot of different sands that were available to them. So that's a great question because you have to think about why did they choose this raw material? Was there a particular function it provided to that vessel, or did it make the clay paste workable? Was it just, hey, this is in my backyard, I'm using that? So you really have to consider, this is where we get down to the potter's choice. Why did he choose something? Was it because this vessel was going to be a cooking pot? Was it because he wanted to paint something nice on it and he didn't want to have huge chunks of basalt coming out of it? How is he making it? And so those are great leading questions when we identify what they used as tempering and then try to better understand why that choice was made and what was available.
Cool. Yeah, we don't have basalt in my area, so I don't have any experience with it, but I've ground up almost everything but limestone and thrown in my clay. So
yeah.
The next question is coil-and-scrape pottery distinguishable from other pottery at the microscopic level? If so, what evidence is there and what types of microscopy? Am I doing that one right?
Yeah,
microscopy. What type of microscope is used?
Again, we'd probably mostly use a petrographic geological microscope. So that looks like any binocular microscope. It just has some particular lighting features that help us identify the rocks and minerals. This is a challenge. Coil-and-scrape versus usually paddle and anvil in the Southwest. What I have found is that when they're making coil-and-scrape pottery, I think it's a combination of where the groups that use this technique are, but also what the clays they find are good for coil-and-scrape. That is usually these kind of shale clays, and they add grog to it. So in a way, and I wrote a little paper on this with getting great information from Andy. I talked about how there may be decisions about what kind of clay and what kind of temper based on coil-and-scrape. So that could be kind of an indirect way of saying, hey, this pot is made with a certain technology because they're using a particular paste and sand. Usually down in the paddle and anvil areas, you get a lot of coarse sands and secondary clays, and those work great. I made some very terrible, hideous pots with those kind of clays and sand timber, and shale clay I got from around here and grog. And I could really tell that each forming method worked well with that particular paste. One way, if we want to better understand how a pot is made, and hopefully you have a large sherd to do this with, is you actually use zero radiography, X-rays. X-rays can show you some of the pores, and they can show you if those pores, there's always fine pores in pottery, they can show you if they're aligned. That might mean it was wheel thrown. Sometimes you can see that the body of a sherd was wheel thrown, but the neck was hand built, like pinched and coiled. So there's lots of work by a wonderful person named Valentine Roux, who's done a lot of zero radiography to help better understand how pottery was made. In thin section, sometimes I can under the microscope for what I do, I can sort of see that some pores are kind of linear, and that may mean that they've, been used kind of pinched together. The clay was pinched together, or there was some centrifugal force. But I think the best way really is zero radiography. If you've got a large sherd, you can tell coil joints, you can see coil joints, you can see the way that the clay particles and the mineral inclusions, especially with sand, are being kind of turned and twisted and manipulated. But if you want to message me, I can point you towards books that talk about how to do that.
Cool stuff. Yeah, I love to see any hints in the sherds about how it was made. If I can see how wide the coil was, if I can see how they had joined the coils, that's gold. I spent a lot of time on my hands crawling around ruins looking at sherds just for these little clues. You can see little polishing marks, all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and you can see like little anvil depressions if they were doing things like that. So yeah.
Okay, next question is, what would be the average firing temperature in a hearth type pottery firing from say 500 to 1200 AD in Southwest pottery?
Again, from everything I've seen, and I think what Andy's been doing, we see things that range from about 750 up to about 850. And so I can tell you that's for pottery I have looked at no matter where. Uzbekistan, Panama, the Southwest, the Southeast, Egypt, the Near East. There's been few occasions where I've come across pottery fired higher than that. And again, it has to do with maybe there's a glazed surface. So we're talking medieval glazewares, things like that. So at 850, when I'm looking at a piece of pottery on a slide with my microscope, I can usually see that the clay is very, opaque. You don't see a lot of light, and any limestone is gone. It decomposes around 850 at that temperature. So there's some good indications that way at what temperatures you reach. But that seems to be, sometimes there are lower fired pottery. I think some of the early stuff was fairly low fired while they were trying to figure out what, how high they needed to get it to be indestructible.
Sure. Well, what I find is, especially when you're trying a new clay, sometimes you don't know what it needs, right? And some clays need more temperature than others. Like you were saying earlier, that some of these people, they knew, they learned how to do it from somebody else, and they had a set recipe, and they just went to the same place and dug clay, and they fired it in the same way every time. People like me who are replicators, they're always trying new clays or trying to do something they haven't done before. And so there's always that kind of, I wonder what this clay does, And so a lot of times, like my brown body clay that I built a pot from, it'll be fine at say sub 750, like 720, maybe even 700. But that white slip, now it's going to take a little hotter temperature because it doesn't have any minerals in it, right? So some of those minerals act as fluxes, so it has a lower maturation point. And so then when you get it wet, that slip will just start coming off, either flaking off, or it'll even get kind of slimy sometimes, like turning back into clay. So
that makes sense. Yeah, iron's a good flux. If you've got an iron rich clay, you could fire that lower and it would probably solidify pretty nicely even at a lower temperature. But I think the thing I told you once that was probably and the thing that I tell potters, modern replica potters, that gets them going is when I say I've seen evidence of a pot being taken out of the fire hot, because that's anathema. Everybody's like, no, you can never take a pot out hot. But especially up here when we're talking about some of the Cibola whitewares and the White Mountain redwares, I see evidence in the cross section of a sherd where there's this kind of gray core and a sharp line before it turns white, and that's usually indicative of a hot vessel being taken out and being exposed to air for a final oxidation while still hot enough for the oxygen to affect its color and paints. So I think that was something that seems to have been done a lot in this area up here. So.
Yeah, you hear that a lot, and I think a lot of modern pottery, being fired in electric kilns where they ramp up the temperature real slowly and then they bring it back down real slowly, and people haven't really experienced that, and so they're afraid of it, and they're like, oh, your pot's going to crack if you fire it out. So you put enough temper in it and stuff, but you can cool it relatively quickly without cracking if you've done it right. Anybody that's done raku knows that, because they'll take those right out, or they'll even throw them in water sometimes with that raku. Yeah. So it is doable.
Yep.
Next question. This has to do with California. In your research in California sites such as Riverside County and Coachella Valley, what does your research tell us about the people who live there, their lifestyle, and their pottery making?
Well, thank you, whoever read my reports on that. And pottery in California is really interesting. There are challenges, and there's still a lot of work that's being done to really understand who's making it, the traditions, how those groups are interacting. My work in the Coachella Valley was somewhat challenging because that area is surrounded by very large granitic mountains. So what we were finding is that the pottery we were finding in the valley was probably being made in the mountains, but we couldn't get terribly specific about where in the mountains because there's so much granite there that's pretty similar. But I think in that area, there is a general understanding that groups were quite mobile. And would be exploiting resources seasonally where they are available, and that they were using pottery mostly for cooking and maybe a little bit of storage. They weren't hauling a lot of pottery around. So what we suggested was that they were making the vessels in the mountains when they were up there exploiting seasonal resources, and there's more wood in the mountains. So, there's an easier chance of finding clay, water. In this case, they were using clays that were eroding from the granite. So it's kind of already had large inclusions in it. So take it, make a nice pot, plenty of water nearby, lots of wood for firing, and then take it with you where you need it to be. So the grog tempered stuff, there's some stuff that they use grog, which is crushed pottery, kind of more to the south and in the valleys and the Mojaves area, they do a lot of that work. So that's kind of how we understood that these were mobile groups. They situated their pottery making when they were in areas that were good for that, and they had the time, and when they were exploiting animal and plant resources. I think there was a follow-up question about why there's not much pottery going on in Northern California. Is that the next one?
Yeah, the next one is why Central and Northern California native sites do not turn up much pottery. I've seen some articles showing some, but it's oddly primitive and there isn't much.
Well, amazing question. Love this question because this talks about understanding pottery in the context of the environment in which it's made. And simply put, there is hardly any pottery in Oregon, Washington State, and Northern Coastal California because it's too wet. It is too rainy and too humid for a pot to completely dry well enough not to explode when you put it in a fire. So they use basketry. A lot of these groups, again, were moving a bit on the landscape, and they also had resources such as ocean marine animals and shellfish and fish. And so there's also the aspect that they probably didn't need pottery for too much. They could gather acorns. They had a lot of acorns in that area, and they would have to process the acorns because it's a compound in there that's poisonous if you don't kind of get some of that out of the acorns. And they could use baskets for that. They do put the ground acorn in a basket and the water would run through it. I hope I got that right. It's been a long time since I've done work in California. So what you see in those areas is you see them exploiting basketry. There's plenty of reeds and things like that. And so it's both the kinds of ways that they were feeding themselves and the resources they exploited, that they had reeds that were great for making good basketry, amazing, beautiful basketry, and pottery making just wasn't a good thing to do in that area. What you'll find in Southern California is a little similar if you're looking at sites like in coastal LA. Some of those really have no pottery on them, very little pottery. They didn't need it. But then if you go into the Coachella Valley area and you go further inland, then you'll start picking it up again. in areas where you can make a pot, it can dry and be fired successfully, and maybe it is easier and better to use than something made of reeds. These are great questions. This is what we do. This is why we look at pots. We want to understand, why they made a decision. Why was pottery chosen? Why was it not? And how they could use pots. And sometimes you just don't need a pot.
Is that Southern California stuff all paddle and anvil?
I believe the majority of it is. It's very coarse material, especially when they're using that granitic stuff. So I think it is largely paddle and anvil in that area. So I've done, again, this Coachella Valley project. I've done a couple of projects in Southern California, not a lot. I was actually just working on a report that was more of a background research report. So I was looking in just recently the LA area, and everything I was reading about archaeological sites in that area, they didn't have pottery. So
I got to go out and visit Tony Soares, who's a replicator in Southern California last summer. He lives in Joshua Tree, California, and
lovely.
And he does really big paddle and anvil jars. And we even got to go out and collect clay and talked about some of the prehistoric sites in the area. So it was real interesting for me because it was very different from what I'm used to seeing here in Southern Arizona. Very cool when you can put your toe into some other cultures, some other different groups.
Oh, it's great.
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry, Mary.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I'm very fortunate that I, through my company and working at Desert, that I've been able to look at pottery from, South Carolina, Panama, Uzbekistan, other places. I've even looked at a little pottery from England. And I always love the diversity and the ingenuity, but also how, making a pot has its parameters. There are certain sort of technological constraints to what can and can't be done. So it's great to sort of go to these different places and see what's the local expression of making a pot within that culture and that time, given what we know is sort of some of those technological constraints, and how does that help us understand how people lived in the past and what that pot was for. Like I said, I've looked at transport vessels that were used to carry wine and oils and resins, and then I've looked at cooking pots or little pinch pots, or I've even looked at dirt. I've had several projects just looking at dirt. And so even things that haven't been, turned into my beautiful pottery is still helpful with the methods I have to look at. So, and plasters, I've looked recently at plasters, a couple in Arizona, but a fair amount in Egypt, looking at how, and that's good. Another technology. How do you make plasters? What are the constraints? What can you do? What are the raw materials? Where can you innovate? What are the different, things they try? They learn. What I found is that prehistoric people, or any people really, they learn their materials really well. They learn them quickly. They know what they can and can't do. They know where there's lots of rooms for changes, and they know what can be done. So I'm always impressed by people today, like you, Andy, and people in the past, and what they're able to create.
One of the always the most surprising thing to me in looking at ancient pottery from around the world is how, like you said, it's very different, but there's so many commonalities. I've seen so many sherds, ancient sherds or ancient pots from like the Middle East or China, that if I saw them on the ground out here in Arizona, I wouldn't even think twice. They're that similar. The designs, the kind of red on brown is a pretty common color for pottery worldwide, because that's the color that clays and minerals often come in. And the same kind of maybe like geometric forms and stuff. And some of them are just, to me, just surprised. They look like they came off of a Holcomb site here in, the Tucson area. So it's neat to see that people around the world came up with similar answers to, the same problems.
Yeah, I've come to realize that digging in dirt and sand on a beach and making a spiral on pottery seems to be like a little human thing. I'm on the beach, I dig a hole. It's just, you have to dig a hole. You're on the beach. And spirals are really common. Just that idea of starting and then going like this. Spirals seem to be a universal thing. I think they're also very common in nature. So it's dirt and spirals always connect us back to nature.
Yep. All right, I've got one. This is the last pre-submitted question.
Okay.
And this is, I'm curious whether she has run into anything she finds particularly surprising?
All the time, of course, but some good examples. I was looking at some pottery from Utah, and I've been doing my kind of using a microscope to look at things for 10 years, and I was like, I know everything. And I found something, and I was like, I have no idea, and it was quite common, so I had to figure out what it was. And so I was fortunate in that I could kind of use the other minerals to figure out what this one was. And I also looked at the geology near the area where the pot had come from. And I found out it was a mineral called allanite. I'd never heard of, not very common. It's a weathering product from another mineral. And what was great is that its presence isn't very common. And the site was down in this valley. I think it was Beaver Valley in Utah, and there was a huge granite outcrop mountain range called the Mineral Mountains to the east at about 30 kilometers, something like that. And so it was really clear in a case like this that they were probably making these pots in the Mineral Mountains and bringing them down into the valley where they were using them. Great example of being able to really see movement of people and making pots when it was convenient in a place that was good for making pots. So that was great. I was just in Egypt. I have to go to Egypt to make make thin sections either, that's the slides I look at, either on site or at the French Institute in Cairo. So I was just last spring at a site in Middle Egypt called Sohag, working on some more kind of somewhat modern pottery in Egypt that had been found in a place called the Red Monastery, which my friends had been working at and recently conserved. And during the conservation, they were clearing out some houses that had been put in the monastery when it was not as heavily used. So most people are surprised to know that there are Christians in Egypt. There are a lot called Coptic Christians. They have many churches. They were established there very early on. And so they still practice and have facilities in churches. So we were working with them. And I thought I'd seen most everything in Egypt. I was like, oh, it's Nile, or it's a calcareous clay, or it's mixed, or some shale stuff and everything. And I came across some stuff that everybody had been saying was schist timber that they were using. And the issue in Egypt is that you don't have schist a lot. There's some kind of in the eastern desert, way far away from the Nile Valley. So I was like, well, let's take a look. And it turned out it was not schist, actually. It was talc, which could look like schist because it can be shiny too. So it was talc, actually. So that's a weird thing. That's a weird thing to use. Yeah. So the clay was still iron rich. So this one's kind of been a challenge. Not only was it just I've been working in Egypt for 15 years and finally came across something where I was like, never seen it, don't know what it is. So it's still likely that, again, the talc would be found in those same areas in the eastern desert way far away. And there is a little bit of ethnographic data that's come down to suggest that they would probably make these kind of vessels near the outcrop, and there'd be some other deposits eroding away into a kind of a iron-rich brown clay, and then the talc is either in it or maybe they're adding a little bit to it. I don't know why you would do this. It doesn't seem at the moment we can tell if that's for particular technological reasons. Modern Egyptians, I have found, and most people in Egypt don't want to spend large quantities of time in the eastern desert. It is not like southern Arizona. It is sand and rock and no plants. So I once talked to a group of students, and I was like, Egyptian students, I was like, if you go in the desert, and they're like, no, we do not do this. Why would you do this? I was like, yeah. So we're really trying to, we've got the ethnographic information that's so helpful to us, but we're trying to understand more about why you would do this and how they're using these pots. So I would say I always find something surprising, and then it's just a matter of what it's going to challenge me. Is it going to challenge me in identifying it or understanding why you would use it, or how it came to be? And that's why I love what I do. And I'm so fortunate to get to do what I do. And the people I collaborate with are amazing. They have so much information, so it makes my results so much more meaningful to be able to work with them and have their insights, and to know what they know a little bit, and the resources to better understand how people behaved. And it's great work. It's always interesting.
Fascinating. Yeah, I've really enjoyed listening to your your answers today, Mary, because
Thank you.
what you do, you know, it ties in with what I do. I need to connect people like you to better understand what I'm trying to do. So it's always great to, even if you're talking about stuff in Egypt and Uzbekistan or something, you know, it's always informs in some way, even if it's not directly, right? But like I said, some of your reports, you know, I go back to a lot because they do have a lot to do with what I do. The other thing, Mary showed up at the Kiln conference at least maybe 3 times, 4 times?
I think 3 times. Yeah, I'll be there this year.
Like one year, she brought her microscope, and all the potters had fun looking at her microscope and seeing the sherds the way she sees them, because it's very different from the way we see them. We might handle the sherd to get, you know, to look at it, or we might even use like a little jeweler's lens, you know, to look at it up close. But when she does a thin section and cuts it, you know, and then she can literally pass light through that, that's a whole different thing. It's really, really fascinating. And then the other thing was when she brought that little handheld thingamajig.
Portable XRF, yeah.
That was so much fun. And everybody would like bringing their pots up and saying, oh, hit this and hit this paint and hit this clay body here. And, you know, and then writing down, you know, oh, it said this and she said that, you know, trying to get information about their clays and their minerals they're using for paints and things that then they can use to try to replicate the pottery. So fascinating stuff and really, really interesting. So I appreciate you taking the time today, Mary.
Thank you. No, thank you. I credit you with getting me to make my own hideous pots and try to do them badly. And of course, I put them out of my misery and out of their misery, and I break them and look at them under the microscope. But it's been great because that's, you know, sometimes we get sucked into our sort of archaeology science world, and it's so wonderful to talk to people like you and the other people at the Kiln conference and really understand, like, hey, I tried this and it didn't work, or I tried this and it didn't work. And it really helps us to take that information and do our own experiments, or consider, you know, how I can interpret what I'm seeing in a way that makes sense with what you guys have experienced. And so it's been great. And so it's just, everybody's so helpful out there. So it's really nice. And yeah, if there's any more, did anybody post any questions or?
Yeah, there's a few here.
Sure, I have some time. It's no problem.
The first one was, how do you determine the age of the pottery? We might have covered that.
I don't really do that, actually. My methods are more about understanding production and where things are made and how.
Is there a way to date a ceramic sherd?
There is, actually. I have a good friend. Her name is Amber Hood. She works in Europe. And what she does is a very scientific technique that involves taking a quartz grain from the sherd, and she applies optical stimulated luminescence. I hope I got that right for her. And what that does is when the quartz grain was fired, when the pot was fired, it resets. I believe it's the electrons in it. This is where I'll get a little fuzzy. And so it resets them, and then they accumulate again over time. And so when she analyzes them, she gets that I guess light, in a way, luminescence, to come out, and she can measure it. And that is how she can help understand how old a pot is, if you want to do it directly on the vessel. Sometimes you can get some pots that have plant material that's been carbonized. So you could actually do radiocarbon dating. It's a little hard to do because, you know, there's not a lot of it in a pot. Otherwise, we rely on wonderful ceramicists to look at changes through time and the way pottery is shaped and decorated, and they can tie that into excavated layers that have been dated through radiocarbon dating or other methods. So they can say, okay, well, I know this sherd came from this layer dated to this time, and then they can look at, you know, what comes before and after. Just as our trends and our clothes change, the trends and the way the pottery is made changes. So, but that's a great question. I take advantage of the people who have done that, so that when I'm looking at some pottery, one of my first questions is, before I analyze it, when is it date? So I know what kind of we're talking about, what time period, what would be going on at that time.
Wes asked the question, how can you tell the temperature pottery was fired at?
That's, again, I can tell usually through the clay has been, we call it sintering. So as the temperature rises in a clay, the particles actually melt, essentially. the actual lattice work of a clay will kind of break up, and the bonds will break, and the what's holding those bonds together comes apart as it's fired up. It's a chemical reaction. And so let's say I've got a pot that I'm looking at under my microscope that's been fired to about 750. When I look at it, a lot of the light will interact with those clay particles. So it'll look different as I turn the stage, and it'll have optical activity. I can see things are going on. I can see the light. When I look at a pot that's fired closer to 850, I won't see much of that. So I can turn the stage and the light just doesn't pass through. It doesn't change the way that clay looks because it's melted. And so when you've got something that's melted, it won't allow the light to pass through or interact with the light as much.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
The other one is the limestone. We know decomposes around 850. So if it has limestone in it, if the clay had limestone in it and that's gone, that'll be another kind of confirmation that we're talking about a higher temperature. So those are sort of the benchmarks. And I usually give a range. I usually will say something like, this looks like it's fired between 750 and 800. This one looks like it's fired between 800 and 850 or higher than 850. Scanning electron microscopy and a few other methods can get more precise on firing temperatures, but it's very challenging because so much affects the way a pot will look. It's not just the temperature, it's the atmosphere, it's the duration of firing, it's the clay itself. Does it have iron in it? Is that acting as a fluxing agent? It's a complicated thing to try to know. So I think we usually aim for, more general assessments.
I know some people do refiring tests.
Yep.
And do you do that, or is that something that somebody else would do?
I don't. I never really encountered that until I started working much in the Southwest. A lot of the refiring is actually done to see if the same clay was used, just the atmosphere and firing was different. So they'll take maybe, 30 sherds and they'll refire them, usually I think at like 900 in an oxidizing environment. And if they all turn the same color, then they say, well, it's all a similar clay that was used. It's just that's where I help ceramicists a lot. Sometimes they'll say, okay, I've got these 3 groups and they look different to me, but I don't know why, and I'm not sure why. And I can look at them, and sometimes I will say, well, they're all made with the same clay paste. It's firing that is different, and let's discuss why that is, why they're doing firings.
One thing that I think a lot of people, not archaeologists, but just potters in general, don't understand, if you're coming from the world of electric kilns, is that the atmosphere varies so much in this type of firing that the same clay can come out very, very different depending on the fire itself, and that a fire is based on so many variables, the wind or the fuel moisture or the type of fuel used or all kinds of things. And then, your clay may come out gray, it may come out brown, it may come out red, same clay. So then, if you refire it in an electric kiln, you can take those all to the same level, and then you can compare them, if they're using the same one.
Yeah, they've done great.
What's that?
I said that, they've done, some of my colleagues have done great work on that with the refiring, better understand what's going on. So I'm going to
go ahead and wrap up.
Okay.
I wanted to remind everybody to hit the like button if you can. That'll help me in the algorithm. John Olson's GoFundMe is linked below. He's suffering from cancer. The Southwest Kiln Conference is the first week in October. Okay. I appreciate Mary showing up and answering everybody's questions. I appreciate all you for asking the questions. And those were really great questions. And there were more than we could even get through in an hour's time. So maybe we'll do this again sometime. I think we had something like, we have like 56 concurrent viewers right now. So we did real well.
Thank you all.
Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody. Have a good weekend, Mary.
You too. Take care. Bye.